So thank you so much for joining us for our Missouri U.S. Senate Candidate Town Hall Series, hosted by the Joe Biden for Missouri Facebook group, 20,000 members strong, bipartisan group of Republican, Independent, and Democratic voices across Missouri. My name is Rachel Patusik. I'm a contributing writer to the Kansas City Pitch, and I will be your moderator tonight. And thank you to Bree and to Liz and everyone with Joe Biden for Missouri Facebook group for organizing this series. And thank you so much for being here and tuning in. And I'm so excited to be here with you. This is the fourth town hall in our series. And tonight we're featuring candidate Jewel Kelly. Our past three town halls featured Spencer Toder, Timothy Shepard, and Lucas Kuntz. And you can find tonight's recording and all of our prior recordings of our town halls on the Joe Biden for Missouri Facebook page. And we are proud to partner with the Kansas City Pitch to run these also at thepitchkc.com. At each town hall, we have an hour-long conversation with a U.S. Senate candidate running for Missouri's open seat in 2022. For tonight and for each town hall, we give each night's guest a few minutes for opening remarks, and then it's all you. We want to open this up to you, and I'm so excited to see your questions coming in. So whether you're tuning in here in our Zoom room or you're on Facebook, we're taking your questions from the chat, so be sure to share them. We're watching the chat, and we want to bring your questions forward. And also be sure to watch the chat for links from our candidates where you can learn more about ways to get involved and take action. So our guest tonight is Jewel Kelly. I'm going to jump right in and I'm going to introduce Jewel very briefly, and then I'm so excited to hear more from him before we go into questions. So Jewel Kelly is a military veteran. He's a small business owner, and he lives in rural Festus, Missouri in Jefferson County. And he is the oldest of 18 children, which is incredible. And he grew up in Rantoul, Illinois, a rural town 200 miles northwest of St. Louis. He served 10 years in the U.S. Air Force. He runs his own real estate business with his wife, Karen, who's joining us tonight too. So excited to have you here. And is the co-founder of the nonprofit organization, A Fighting Chance Foundation, which focuses on increasing mental health awareness. So Jewel, thank you so much for everything you've done for our country and to serve the community. Take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Rachel. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. My name is Jewel Kelly, and I am very honored and humbled to have the opportunity to run for the U.S. Senate. I'm running for the U.S. Senate because too many people are suffering. America is only as strong as our weakest link, and we no longer can suffer in silence. As Democrats, as Americans, we know that we have to reduce the cost of healthcare, including mental health. We also know that we have to stimulate the economy to create more jobs. We know that we have to reduce the cost of education and address student debt. We also have to protect the environment and address climate change. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have to ensure that we provide equal protection under the law. Those are objectives that I think the majority of Americans would agree that we need to do those things. The question is always how and why. And during the brief introduction, it was discussed that I'm the oldest of 18 brothers and sisters, but I want to tell you briefly why it's so important to me. It is very important because as I grew up, again, being the eldest of 18 brothers and sisters, living in a tiny trailer, 50 foot long by 10 foot wide, it was tough. But the reality of the situation is today, it's even tougher than when I grew up. When I went to college, first one to graduate college, first one to get my MBA, and I thank my parents and I thank God tremendously for allowing me to have those opportunities. I thought that this is as tough as it gets. But my younger sister, who's 12 years younger, she went to the same university, got the same job out of college, same position. She made less than I did almost 15 years earlier. And that's just an example. I don't need to tell you all that it is harder today than it was even 15 to 20 years ago. So I'm running because people are suffering. I certainly want to talk about some of the things that we're trying to do with our campaign. mental health is extremely important. Personally, we've experienced a death by suicide. My bonus daughter died by suicide when she was only 17 years old. And after she died, we went through those 4 stages of grief, right? We went through the shock of her death. We went through the anger of how did we miss the signs, because she was going to see a psychologist. She was going to see a psychiatrist, right? But we actually thought she was doing better the week she made that fateful decision. So we were quite angry. How did we miss those signs? And then the depression set in, as you would expect. She's gone from us in body. And the last stage, acceptance. And once we realize that nothing is going to change unless we change, that's when we moved and took action. And Karen and I, we reached out to family and friends, and 7 brave souls joined us to start the Fighting Chance Foundation. We have a licensed professional counselor, a medical doctor, an attorney, a physical therapist, dear friends. We all joined, and the purpose of that foundation was twofold. One, it was to promote the mental health first aid class. Frankly, if we had known about the class and had taken the class, my bonus daughter, Cameron, might still be here today. And then the second part, which is even tougher, is to address the parental bias. No one thinks it's going to happen to them. And so as our foundation started to host different events to engage the community, we quickly realized that, of course, money is at the center of funding is at the center of our challenge, right? You need instructors, and you need a place to hold the meetings and so forth. So it takes funds. And fortunately, we were able to work with the American Foundation for Suicide, and they have a local grant that comes to the state. So we were able to go free of charge. But there is a cost to this, even the materials themselves. Like, they give you really good materials. I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is the book that you get when you take the class. It's called Mental Health First Aid Class. This book isn't cheap, right? So it definitely takes funds to do that. But that's just one example of what we need to do, and why I'm starting off at the very top of this call talking about mental health is because people are dying, right? People, especially our younger generation, between the age of 15 and 19, it's the second leading cause, and in certain areas, it's the leading cause of death. You can't get a more important issue than something that's killing our kids. So that's one example. Now, what does this have to do with the larger picture? Mental health is certainly very, very important, and it affects every family. But the last 18 months, if you think about what we've been through, I call it the American grief. Think about the shock that we went through when we saw recorded George Floyd being murdered, right? Hands behind his back, face down, with the police officer with his hands in his pocket, sunglasses on the top of his head. We were shocked. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wasn't the last time that someone, was killed by the police. But the manner and the nonchalant attitude of the police officer truly shocked America. Think about the pandemic and how many hundreds of thousands of people died. And also think about how even the survivors, we were kept apart from our loved ones, almost similar to the stigma of suicide, how it keeps you, isolated because of the shame and the guilt. The pandemic kept us secluded and isolated from our loved ones. And we suffered, and we went through the depression stages alone in many cases. And then think about anger, the anger that we felt on January 6, 2021. I'm a military veteran, and I joined 2 months after September the 11th, and I served 10 years in the Air Force. I hadn't been as angry, since September the 11th on January 6th, right? When I saw our American flag being used to beat law enforcement officers as they were invading the Capitol, looking to assault and intimidate Congress, right? So America went through those 4 stages as well. And then the last stage is acceptance. We realize that nothing is going to change unless we change. That's why I'm running, right? We no longer can suffer in silence. If we want change, we have to be the change. I told my younger brothers and sisters when I was the first person to graduate, if I can do it, you can do it. And that's the same message that I'm saying on the campaign trail. If a skinny Black guy can run in rural America for the US Senate, surely each one of us, as long as we meet the requirements, we can run for, school board. We can run for city council. We can run for alderman. We can run for mayor. We can run for Senate. We can run for governor, right? We can do this. So that's my message is there is no fear in love, right? We know that the stakes are high. We know that people are dying if we continue to allow the current politicians to go with the status quo. This is unacceptable. That's why I'm running. And I'm very, very excited to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jewel. Really appreciate that rundown. Very powerful. And I really appreciate learning more about you. And I think you capture well a lot of the struggles that we've been dealing with over the past 18 months. I want to talk a little bit more about why you feel you're the right candidate for this time. Can you tell us a little bit more about why now for this role?
Yes, of course, there are requirements in the Constitution that you have to meet, right? There are age requirements, there are citizen requirements, residency requirements, and I meet those. I'm 46 years old, by the way. So, anyone that meets those requirements is actually qualified to run for the Senate. But a little bit about my personal background. I served 10 years in the military. I also have 10 years of corporate experience running a P&L, profit and loss statement. I've supervised civilians and I've supervised and led military personnel. And then I've also, with my wife, and she's a much better realtor than I am, I'm a small business owner. So I understand the challenges of a small business. If we don't operate within a budget, if we're not listening to our customers, even if we work 20, 30, 40 hours, we don't get a single penny until that deal closes. Can you imagine if our politicians, if they didn't find a way to operate within a budget and they were not paid unless the bill passed or unless the problem was solved? Can you imagine how different our politics would be if they operated like realtors, where you don't get paid unless you close the deal? So, I have corporate experience, I have military experience, and I truly believe that, and I'm also running as a moderate. I truly believe, and you say, what do you mean by running as a moderate? What does that mean? It simply means being reasonable. And what I'm offering that I have not heard so much on the campaign trail, Democrat or Republican, is we need to stop focusing on the politics and start focusing on principle. And the principles are pretty straightforward. We can ask ourselves 3 questions. Is it legal? Is it safe? And is it fair? It doesn't matter whether it's a Republican idea, bill, or a Democrat. If I can answer yes to all 3 of those, I can get behind that. And so, for example, think about, healthcare, think about the Affordable Care Act. How many times was the first question, is it legal? Right? How many times did that Affordable Care Act have to go up to the Supreme Court? It went up at least twice, and there's still issues that are being decided. So the first question, is it legal, is very, very important. The Supreme Court said that the Affordable Care Act is legal because it's a tax. The second question, is it safe? And then I ask ourselves, is it safe? Think about Missouri. Is it safe to increase healthcare costs and refuse to expand Medicare during a pandemic? Is that safe? I would say it's not safe. And then, is it fair? Is it fair that someone that was born to parents that were rich, that they have healthcare simply because their parents were rich, and then you have someone else that was not rich, and certainly didn't come from parents that were rich, they don't have access to healthcare? right? Even though I grew up poor, I thank God, my dad, he had a union paying job, and part of the union benefits was they had health care. 17 of my brothers and sisters graduated or went to college. 12 graduated college. 6 have master's degrees. And we're proud of that. But what I want to talk about is the sibling. I said 17 out of 18. I want to talk about that sibling that didn't get a chance to go to college. The reason why she didn't go to college is because she was born blind, never been able to see, never been able to walk or talk. She has cerebral palsy. She was not expected to live past 3 weeks, but it was only because my dad had health care, and the part that wasn't covered by healthcare, Medicaid covered that she was able to get the help that she needed. And she is alive today at 28 years old. So the point is, even though I grew up poor, I was fortunate, I was privileged to have parents that had healthcare. How is it fair that if I didn't have parents, or if someone else didn't have parents that had healthcare, right? It's no fault of the child that their parents didn't have a job, or they didn't have healthcare like we did. So the fairness question is a very tough question, but it is very, very relevant. And so to recap, is it legal? Is it safe? Is it fair? That's my message. And if we can return to principle and hold our government officials accountable by asking and having them answer those 3 questions, I think America will be a better place.
That's very interesting. It's very interesting that you have that perspective that helps us understand your framework, and it raises a lot of questions too. And we have some great questions in chat. Keep them coming. Dawn, I see you got questions here. And Amy, thank you so much for your questions. We got another question about this perspective. You describe yourself as a moderate, and that raises some questions for folks. When some people hear moderate, they sometimes think that means pro-life or anti-choice. And so can you tell us a little bit more about your stance in regards to women's rights for
Yes.
reproductive health?
Let me say right off the top, I am pro-choice. One of the things that's really personal to me, as you would expect, is being the eldest of 18 siblings. I thank God my mother had the choice and made the choice to bring all of my siblings into the world. She had that choice and she made that choice. Mm-hmm. So I want to be crystal clear. That's what I believe. I do not believe that I or any politician has the authority under the US Constitution, or even has the situational awareness to be able to decide for someone else whether or not they should have a child. That's not our place. That's between the person, the mother and her medical doctor. And if she believes in God, right? That's not something that I myself as a politician should ever be concerned about making those type of decisions. So I am definitely pro-choice. The reason why I'm saying I'm a moderate, and I know that of course labels can, people use labels for different reasons. Moderate simply means being reasonable. It doesn't mean being pro-life or pro-choice. It doesn't mean being pro-gun or against the Second Amendment. It simply means being reasonable. And our politics today, we are so polarized that we actually think being to the extreme is a good thing. Whereas, of course, especially in the Senate, and we'll probably get some questions about the filibuster and so forth, it's even more important today to find consensus, not even consensus, just find agreement within the 2 parties. So that's why I'm saying I'm a moderate. I'm not saying it to win a certain demographic. I'm saying it because I truly believe it. If I can say, yes, it's legal or it should be legal. Yes, it's safe. Yes, it's fair. That's being reasonable. That's being moderate. That's my belief.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, great. You mentioned filibuster. That is a hot topic for so many people. That was a huge topic of discussion in our last town hall. And the first question off the bat here in chat in our Zoom, Dawn is asking, where do you stand on this?
Yes. So, of course, and I think the person that's asking the questions, we're looking at today, and we're looking at the policies that are being proposed, and we're looking at the speed as to which they're going through Congress. And today, the filibuster is one of those tools that are being used to prevent certain policies from being put to a vote. And that's very, very frustrating. That's today. Of course, if we were to think between the years of 2017 and January 2021, as a Democrat, you thank God for the filibuster, right? Because the Democrats were not in control and the Republicans were in control. And I shudder to think what would have happened if we didn't have the filibuster. However, as we've seen, certain politicians are able to get things done. They're able to change the rules, even with or without a filibuster, right? They're able to prevent Supreme Court justices from being appointed, such as in the Merrick Garland case with President Obama. And then they're able to push justices through at breakneck speed, which is what we saw with the last Supreme Court justice with Amy Coney Barrett. So it's very, very frustrating. And as Democrats, some of us are really saying we need to get rid of it. And I think we should never put the cart before the horse. If the policy that we're trying to propose is legal, is safe, is fair, we need to do whatever we need to do to make sure that that policy is enacted, right? So if I were a sitting senator today and there were bills such as the John Lewis Voting Act, and the only way that that bill could get passed is through eliminating the filibuster, then we have to eliminate the filibuster if that's the only way that that bill can be passed, because that bill certainly is legal, safe, and fair. However, if there are other ways that we can get these bills through without eliminating the filibuster, then of course that's preferable, because as much as I would love for a Democrat to be in power, we know that the way our Constitution and the way democracy works, that's not always going to be the case. And we do need those checks and balances. So my personal opinion is, we do need to do everything that we possibly can. And I think the Democrats are. I think Joe Biden and President Biden in good faith is trying to negotiate with the Republicans to come up with a bipartisan bill. Bless him for trying. But at the end of the day, if we get no progress, then you have to do what you have to do. The filibuster is simply a tool, and we cannot let a tool get in the way of justice, of safety, and of fairness. Nothing should get in the way of those three things.
Thank you for explaining that, and I appreciate your explanation of your position there. I want to talk a little bit about the field of candidates we have now. We have a lot of people running for the Senate race, and that's to be expected. And I would love for you to share a little bit more about what you feel makes you unique amongst this large field of candidates. What do you plan to do differently? How do you plan to campaign differently?
Yes. So, I don't want to say anything bad about my fellow Democrats. So I would much rather just say what I'm doing, right? And so I think it starts with even something as saying I'm a moderate, and I've explained to you what I mean by being moderate. I don't mean being wishy-washy or anything like that. I'm simply mean moderate means being reasonable. Reasonable means making sure that things are done in a legal way, making sure in a just way, making sure things are done in a safe way, and making things sure things are done in a fair way. That's my message, right? And I don't hear any of the other candidates focusing on justice, safety, and fairness. That's point number one. Point number two is, for us to win, we know that we can't do what we did in 2016 or even in 2020. We have to grow the base. We have to find more voters. And so if you want to grow the base, you want to have a candidate that is going to appeal to the entire state. We know that if we do not engage St. Louis, and we do not engage Kansas City, and we don't engage the suburbs, and we don't engage rural America, we are not going to win. I happen to live in rural America. I happen to be a veteran. I happen to be a small business owner. I don't think any of those other candidates have all of those characteristics, right? So I think, there are artificial things that are about me that are different, that are completely outside of my control. And then there are my experiences that are certainly different than any of the other candidates. But I think the most important thing is voters choose who they want to represent them. And so what I'm focusing on is listening to voters. What do voters want? And so that's why I'm very happy to be here to listen to your questions. And frankly, not just listen to the questions, I want to hear your ideas. So if you're asking a question, I'll try to answer it. But I also, and I'm asking you, please let me know if you think that there should be a certain idea or a certain, obstacle or barrier that we should be focused on. Please let me know that as well.
Thank you. So you're encouraging us to share our ideas with you, to share
Absolutely.
them in chat, what we'd like to see.
Yes.
That's fantastic. And I encourage folks to do that. We're about halfway through our town hall right now with Jewel Kelly, who's running for US Senate in Missouri. You grew up in rural America. You're from you're in the St. Louis area, but tied to our rural communities. And we're talking strategy right now and digging into this a little bit more. There's a great question from Amy in chat on Zoom. What events do you have scheduled in rural counties? I'd love to add to that. What's your approach to connect with rural Missouri?
Yes. So we take the approach, and in the business world, there's a phrase that says, start small to go fast. And what that means is you can't boil the ocean. So the very first thing that we're doing is we're reaching out almost county by county. Some county Democratic clubs have combined. And so they said, we know it's a long distance. So we will, have a meeting where several counties are invited. But the very first thing that we have to do, and my biggest challenge, by the way, is of course, raising money. The way you raise money is to get name recognition. The way you get name recognition is to engage your voters, right? So of course, we're focusing in the digital world on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and thank God for those things because it evens the field somewhat. We don't have to necessarily just rely on, cable television or the news networks to get our name out there. So thank God for that. But even more importantly is actually meeting voters in person, listening to their ideas, incorporating their ideas, doing the research, which I've done, and communicating the message that we can be the change. It's not about just Jewel Kelly running for office. What my message is, if we want change, we have to be the change. Being successful for me is not being elected to office. Being successful to me is if we get our community, start with 5. If I can get 5 other candidates to run, right? In different levels, they can run at the county level, at the state level, at the city level, whatever. That's what my objective is. It's one thing for me to say, we all should go vote. It's another thing for me to say, well, it's great to vote, but it's even better if you have someone to vote for. And if you want someone to vote for, why not be you, right? If we feel that we're not being represented correctly, if we feel, for example, Medicaid, we went out and voted. We did more than vote. We passed an initiative, the initiative to expand Medicaid. And we still now are having to go to the Supreme Court to get the will of the voters enacted, right? The only way that's going to change is for us to be in those positions where we can decide this is what the voters wanted. We're going to fund what the voters want, right? The only way that's going to change is if we run. If on the flip side, if you look at what's happening in Missouri in particular, where I live in Jefferson County, and there are many positions where the Republican ran unopposed. Whose fault is that? If they're running unopposed because we didn't run, or we didn't think we could run, or we didn't have the money, or we're not connected, whatever excuse we use to say we're not going to get engaged, if we don't step up to the plate, then nothing is going to change. The only way it's going to change is if we run. So I'm very, very focused on not only my campaign, but even more importantly than that, it's about encouraging, inspiring, demonstrating that we can truly make the change that we need the moment we stop sitting down and we start running for office. It's the best feeling in the world when you see young people out there getting engaged, because we know that they're our future. And we know that democracy only works when the constituents, the citizens, are engaged. So that's my message. That's what I'm trying to do. And I believe that the majority of voters, once they hear it, they can get behind it, because they know it's not going to just be a Jewel Kelly or Josh Hawley, proposal. It's going to be based on principle. Is it legal? Is it safe? Is it fair? If we can answer yes to those three things, then we truly can compromise. We truly can make a difference.
That's really interesting. I feel you inspiring people on this call to run for office. And I hope that people on this call are listening and wanting to do that. That's inspiring. That has come up as a question in the past. We have so many seats across Missouri where there was no challenger. And it sounds like you are invested in supporting down ballot candidates and helping recruit down ballot candidates. Is
Absolutely.
That right? Yeah. So would you be working on coordinating with them, further on down the campaign? How would you envision working with them? Yes,
and I don't want to name names, but even as recently as yesterday, someone that was interested in, possibly pursuing running at the state level reached out and said, "Hey, what do you think?" And so I gave my honest opinion, and that's what I love, right? Especially not being originally from here, I wondered, and I considered it's much easier to let the next person do it. Someone that was born and raised here, someone that, has 5 generations of roots here in Missouri. But we know that, courage takes leadership. We know that, as I said earlier, there is no fear in love. And that's straight from scripture. When you know that people are dying because we're not doing what we're supposed to do, then all of those concerns that kept us in fear, all of a sudden, they're no longer a barrier, because we know that there's too much at stake. So yes, I certainly want to support down ballot candidates. I will even support not just down ballot, but even, my fellow senators. We're all in this, Senate candidates. We're all in this together, right? If I don't learn something from them, then that means I'm not listening. If they don't learn something from me, then that means they're not listening. So we all can work together. Our goal is to send the best candidate against the Republicans in the August primaries. And then, of course, in November, we want to be able to cross the finish line. So that's going to take listening from everybody. That's going to take working together from everyone. We're not competing against each other. We're running, and we're trying to, we're basically trying to get to the finish line first. And the good news is this: even if, let's say, I don't make it in 2022, I certainly want to, but in 2 years, 2024 is just around the corner. So we have to think long-term. This is not just whatever we need to do so that I win. We truly have to do the work. Stacey Abrams is a great example as to what and it wasn't just Stacey Abrams, by the way, but it certainly, her leadership certainly mattered. But Stacey Abrams and her team did a great job in Georgia, but it wasn't overnight. She actually lost her race, but because she put in the work and because she worked together, we now have 2 Democratic senators sitting in Congress. And that's what I'm talking about here. So it behooves me, and it behooves everyone on the call, to not just think about, what do we need to do to win in 2022, but it's about how do we build a base, and how do we give our young people hope that what we're saying actually happens. We're telling them to vote. We're telling them to get engaged. We're telling them that it makes a difference. How do we make sure that that actually happens? And the only way we do that is to be engaged ourselves.
That's great. I appreciate that. I want to transition a little bit here to, we have such a divided political environment right now. Amy, you raised a really good question in chat about critical race theory, anti-critical race theory, anti-1619 initiatives. We know this is so prolific across the country and right here in Missouri. And, we have folks have shared questions on here about police and systemic racism and fear for themselves and their loved ones. Well, how would you handle some of these issues in the Senate in such a high profile national position?
Yes, we have to appeal to principle and not be distracted. And, the other party, they have gotten really good at distracting us, right? The latest distraction is, the critical race theory and everything that goes along with that. We have the 1619 project and there's the 1776 project, right? So we can get bogged down into fighting whether or not this should be allowed in schools. But if you think about the principle of what is legal and what should be legal, right? So if you think about slavery, at one point it was legal, but the question was, should it have been legal? And eventually, took us a while to get there, slavery was declared illegal. That's principle. That's what we can focus on. We can go back to what's safe, right? We are still in a pandemic. Thank God for the vaccine, but there are millions of Americans that are not as safe as they need to be simply because of the misinformation and the distractions that happened in 2020 and that are continuing to happen in 2021. And then you think about the fairness question, right? We know that there are some of us, my ancestors, as an example, they were not treated fairly, right? We know that, and we can discuss that. But what about today? What can we do today to make sure that we're treating people fair? And I will say this about law enforcement. I'm a military officer. I certainly, recognize the need for law and order, right? Think about our law enforcement officers. When I was a military officer, I was paid reasonably well, right? I had great responsibility and I was paid accordingly. But even as a military officer, I did not have the day-to-day dangers that our law enforcement officials face every day, right? They have to make split-second decisions. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by the fairness question. When I left the military, I considered joining the FBI because I thought, okay, I'm fit. I have a top secret security clearance. This would be a natural fit. And what made me pause was when I looked at the salary of an FBI law enforcement officer, let alone someone that's going to the academy. It wasn't nearly as much as the pay, wasn't nearly as much as a military officer. Now, so my point is, if we expect our law enforcement officers to make the right decision in split seconds, we need to make sure that we hire and retain our best. How can we hire and retain our best if we don't pay them a fair salary, right? Fair in comparison to their responsibilities. There are very few positions in the world where you face the dangers that a police officer has to face and make those split-second decisions. So what I'm saying is, from a fairness perspective, we certainly need to address pay on one hand. On the other hand, is it fair that if we have a police officer that violates their oath to protect and serve the community, is it fair that they cannot be sued? A doctor, if a doctor does something that violates their oath, a doctor can be sued. If a military officer, I was a military officer, if I blatantly disregard the law of armed conflict, I can be held accountable, right? So on one hand, I'm saying that our police officers, by and large, are underpaid. Especially if you look at their salary compared to some of the other critical, essential salaries. On one hand. On the other hand, we have laws that protect or so-called qualified immunity, where we allow certain abuses to take place and we don't hold our officers accountable the way we hold the rest of society. So that's a fairness question, right? That's something that as a senator, we can help correct. We can look at the laws and say, hey, this isn't fair. If most police officers, they're paid at the state and local level. But we also know that the federal government can give state grants to the states so that they can have a more fair, safe, and legal, process. So I think that that's a perfect example of what I mean by is it safe, is it legal, and is it fair, and how that specifically would address some of the issues that are pressing us today regarding, police brutality, whether or not there's systemic racism in our force. If you want to eliminate that, you have to hire and retain the best people. And you're not going to hire and retain the best people if you do not pay them a fair salary that's comparable to what they could make in other career fields.
Interesting. So there's a two-sidedness to this answer here, where you're looking at this from multiple perspectives. And I appreciate you sharing all of your some perspectives around policing and accountability with police officers. And if you're just joining us, I'm seeing we have some new people coming in. Thank you for joining us. We are in our 4th town hall in our series with the Joe Biden for Missouri Facebook group. Tonight, we're talking with Jewel Kelly, veteran, small business owner, nonprofit co-founder. Thank you so much for being here and joining us. You were talking about wages. Let's talk about something that's a really hot topic, a $15 minimum wage. Yes. What are your positions on this? We have a question on chat from someone who says, I have a friend who has her degree in healthcare, and she's making just over $10 an hour. And we are paying fast food workers and retail workers $15 an hour because of worker shortages. What is your position on this? What would you do around this issue and pay at a Senate level?
Yes. So you guys probably know where I'm going with this, and it's intentional, right? I'm going to go back to those 3 questions. What's legal, what's safe, and what's fair, right? But you can see how those 3 questions, by answering those questions, it helps guide us. Should we raise the minimum wage, right? Of course, Congress at the federal level, that's a question for Congress to decide, right? Is it legal? That's exactly, entirely within the scope of Congress. So I'm going to address that later, but I want to acknowledge that that question certainly applies. The second question, is it safe and is it fair? During the pandemic, we realized what is really critically important to us. Who kept us safe, right? And it was the workers in a lot of cases that frankly are paid the least. And then you talk about the fairness question. Of course, fairness depends on, I want to treat you the way I should treat you, the way I expect to be treated, right? And so if we are working 8 hours a day, or sometimes 2 jobs, just to make a living, and we still are below the poverty level, most people would say, I would not want to have to do that. Right? I'm just being honest. Regardless of how you got there or why you're there, most people would not want to work 16 hours a day and still not be able to pay their bills. Just a little bit of reference. The average, and this is nationwide, the average cost for a 2-bedroom house to pay for it, and I'm not talking about utilities or anything like that, it's about $16 an hour. That's the average. That's how much you would have to make to pay for a 2-bedroom house on average. If you're making $7.65 or you're making minimum wage, you can't afford it. So I think the third question, is it fair? I think most people would agree, well, it's not fair using the standard, would I want to do that? Do I want to work 16 hours to do that? If you can say yes, then I say you're in the minority. Most people would say, if I work 8 hours a day, I work hard and do what I'm supposed to do, I should be able to at least make a living. In terms of whether it's safe, it's not safe, right? Because if you can't pay for housing, you're not going to have enough money to pay for healthcare. And if you can't pay for healthcare, then those preventable diseases that could have been addressed are not being addressed. And there's a cost not only to that person, to their family, but to the economy at large. So being underpaid is actually unsafe for the person, and it's unsafe for our communities. And then the first question is it legal? It's legal right now, but it shouldn't be legal, right? Because it shouldn't be legal if we can do better. We are the richest country on earth. We have enough resources where at the end of the day, if you work hard, you do a good job, you should be able to support yourself. And at the current minimum rate, the minimum wage rate, you cannot. So it should not be legal. The minimum wage should be raised. But I think that we really have to focus on the other questions, the safety question and the fairness question, to change the law.
I want to ask you about health. We have a question about vaccine equity for Missouri. The way that it's reported, our questioner asks, it makes it very difficult to know if it is distributed in an equitable way. What would you do to address vaccine inequity in its distribution right now?
Well, you have to look at the data, right? And you have to have transparency. The data should be objective. And if we look at the data and say, this area per population received more or less, then it's not fair. And also it's not safe, right? So I think you start with the data, and if the data isn't very transparent, or if the data isn't collected in a way that makes sense, that most people can understand, then we need to change the way we collect the data so that it does make sense and that it is easy to understand. And then once we look at the data, then we have to make those adjustments based on what's just, based on what's safe, and based on what's fair.
I want to ask you about universal health care. It's a really important question for a lot of people. What's your position on universal health care? How would that look like for businesses? What's your vision or plan for that?
I think the overall goal, whether it's universal health care or single payer healthcare system or Obamacare or Medicare for all, the overall goal is to reduce the cost of healthcare so that everyone can afford it and everyone has access to it. Now, I'm not an economist. I've read some articles. I've even talked to an economist. We had an economist speak to us during our campaigns, specifically about healthcare. And there are different views on whether or not universal healthcare is the best way, and whether or not universal healthcare, even if it is the best way, if it's achievable. I think based on the economic data that I've seen, that it is to use a golf analogy, it's a long putt. But whether we actually have universal health care or not, I think we all agree that we need to reduce the cost. The status quo isn't working. So my approach as a senator would be, the end goal is not necessarily to say we absolutely have to have universal health care. Great, if we had universal health care, I would be very, very happy. But what if we don't, right? Is it all or none? And I say, we have more choices. We have more options than all or none. But I think all of us would agree that we certainly need to reduce the cost. And so working with Congress, President Biden submitted his bill or his plan, and it's going through Congress right now. So as a senator, I'm realistic. I know that regardless, even if I came up with the perfect solution, it's never going to survive intact, right? It's all about working with, at least in the Senate, the 99 other senators. And of course, you have the House, and of course, you have to have the president to sign it. So I think we really have to think bigger than just saying universal health care. I think we have to focus on how to reduce the cost, which, by the way, includes mental health costs. And I think if we can do that, we can get us toward that direction. Would I love universal health care? Yes. But do I think it's achievable right now? given the nature of a 50-50 Senate, if I'm just going to be blunt with you, no, I don't think it's achievable right now. But if we all vote and we all become engaged and we have more and more people that says, yes, healthcare is a universal right, which I believe it is, then who knows, 5, 10, basically as many people as we get engaged in politics that think similarly, that's going to determine whether or not or how quickly we're able to get what we want and what we need.
I agree with that. I want to ask you about Medicare. We have a question from Dawn about Missouri's politics. Sometimes it is a matter of brute force if someone can oppose or block legislation, and Missouri's governor has decided not to enact the will of voters in Medicaid expansion. What would you do to influence Missouri politics around an issue such as Medicaid expansion and where it stands now?
There is no fear in love. We cannot be afraid of losing. Part of the problem that we have today is that we have politicians in place that do not make the right decision because they are afraid of losing. We have to return to principle. And that's one of the things that you will see about me, right? I certainly don't, at least not out the gate, I certainly do not have the most money. I am not the most connected, but I am not afraid of losing because I know that the only way to move forward is to be the change yourself. The only way to encourage others to move forward is to lead by example. And so how would I engage? We know what the right thing to do is. We know that if voters approved, and they did, to expand Medicaid, the right thing to do is to expand Medicaid. And if voting based on principle, voting based on conscience means that I lose my next election, I lose my next election, right? That's what we need. Until we get more people that are willing to lose, that are not afraid to lose, we all lose.
Very powerful. And we are almost out of time. Oh my gosh. Well, we have a great question Janice asked, and I think this is a great question to wrap up on. What campaign plans do you have for volunteers to get involved? Mailings, phone calls, texting? Can you share in chat? Can you tell us how to get connected with your campaign and give us a few words as we wrap up here?
Yes. So of course, the best way to do it is to go to our website, jewelkelly.com. That's our website. You can also email me at info@jewelkelly.com, and we'll put that information in the chat. We are definitely looking for volunteers. We need every bit of help that we can get. I am not the most well-connected or the richest candidate. I would say I'm probably on the other end, but people matter more than money, right? And so getting our voices heard starts with us getting engaged. There is no fear in love. We are one nation under God. We are one race, the human race. We have one standard, justice, safety, equality. Have no fear. Our flag is still here. We are the change. Let's roll.
Thank you so much, Jewel Kelly. Thank you so much. And I see the links shared in chat. Thank you, Bree. It's jewelkelly.com, info@jewelkelly. Folks can email you. Thank you so much for coming on and joining us. And thanks to everyone for being here tonight and for getting involved as we head into the 2020 open Senate seat. And we're really excited. Thank you, Jewel Kelly, and thanks Bree and Liz for helping organize tonight's event.